morning. Welcome to tonight's program with Dr. Bob Grese, who will speak on the topic of Jensen, O.C. Simonds, and today's native gardens. This lecture is presented in partnership with the Friends of the Green Bay Trail and the Glencoe Sustainability Task Force. We extend our special thanks to Brian Lammers of the Friends of the Trail for his ideas and energy around this program. Before I introduce our presenter, let me mention a Jensen bicycle route that I came across on the Evanston Bicycle Club website. There are flyers here, you can get them after the program. It's a 22-mile loop that starts and ends in North Evanston and goes as far north as Highland Park. And the route takes you past 6 examples of Jensen's natural parks and gardens along the North Shore. What a fun summer activity, right? There are flyers on the table here if you want one. And for those of you watching the program, on video, you can find the route cues and other information at the route library at evanstonbikeclub.org. And now for tonight's presenter. Bob Grese is a professor emeritus in the School of Environmental and Sustainability at the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor. And he's the former director of the university's Matthaei Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum. He taught in the landscape architecture program and is a strong advocate of ecologically based design and ecological restoration. He has researched the work of early landscape architects who had advocated such an approach to design, especially the works of O.C. Simonds and Jensen, who were known for the Prairie Style of landscape gardening. Bob is the author of several books, including Jensen, Maker of Natural Parks and Gardens, and these are just for demonstration purposes. And The Native Landscape Reader, and he co-edited Passion for Peonies with David Michener, which we don't have here tonight. He is a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects, as well as the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. He's also an honorary member of the Garden Club of America and a past president of the Ann Arbor Chapter of the Wild Ones. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Bob, and I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I'm going to talk about the work of Jensen and O.C. Simonds, and somewhat within the larger context of movement of native plants and native gardens in the early 20th century, and then try to bring that up to the present to the interest and ideas about those gardens today. So with that, I'll just move into the next slides. So I'll first give a bit of an overview of this early period of pioneers that worked in the area of using native landscape materials, provide some analysis of the work of Jensen and Simonds, and then talk about the lessons learned that can apply to gardens today. In the early 20th century, well, really starting in the late 1800s, and then through the early part of the 20th century, there were a number of people around the country that were really advocating for native landscape design in their parks and gardens, as well as links to various conservation efforts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their work was seen as part of an effort to protect many state and national parks. They saw great growth in our local park systems across the country. And there were a number of these folks that had strong ties to the Chicago area, and I'll talk about those in more depth. These folks included Jensen and O.C. Simonds, who I'll talk more about, Frank Waugh, who was a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Wilhelm Miller, who wrote about Jensen's and Simonds' work as a Prairie Style, and he became the first extension landscape architect in the country for the University of Illinois. Elsa Raymond and Edith Roberts. Edith Roberts studied ecology at the University of Chicago, but went on to teach at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and she teamed up with Elsa Raymond to write a book called The American Plants for American Gardens in the late 1920s. Genevieve Gillette had worked in Jensen's office in Highland Park and was very active in conservation movements around the country, but particularly in Michigan. She was from Michigan, went back there and headed up many of the movements to create a state park system in Michigan. And finally, then Alfred Caldwell was also a protege of Jensen, having worked in his office, went on to teach architecture and landscape architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology, as well as the University of Southern California. He designed the Lily Pool in Lincoln Park, Montrose Point, and a number of other parks in the Chicago area, particularly during the WPA era. And then finally, May Tealgott Watts shouldn't be unknown here in Glencoe and certainly in Highland Park where she lived. She was a naturalist at the Barton Arboretum for many years, writing columns for the Chicago Tribune, and was the author of a book called suddenly my mind is going blank, but Reading the Landscape of America, which is one of the books that actually encouraged me to go into landscape architecture. So I have a great fondness for her and her work. So why would there be interest in the work of these individuals today? They advocated for a regionally based approach to design that was deeply connected to other conservation efforts. Their work has inspired many designers to incorporate ecological principles into their work. And they're pioneers in advocating for the use of native plants, which is seen as one of the major themes in creating more sustainable landscapes across the country. So collectively, the work of Simonds and Jensen in particular became known as the Prairie Style. As I mentioned, Wilhelm Miller was the chief advocate for this. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner there, a pamphlet that he produced as the extension landscape architect at the University of Illinois, which he printed published in 1915. And he described the work of Jensen, Simonds, and also Walter Burley Griffin, whose picture is shown here at the bottom, as the three major advocates creating this style and promoting the use of native plants as part of this prairie style. Walter Burley Griffin was a graduate of the University of Illinois, trained both as an architect as well as a landscape architect. I forget the exact year, I think it was in the late teens or mid-teens. He won a competition for the design of Canberra, Australia, and moved to Australia. And so his influence waned a bit while he was in Australia building their national capital. And he eventually came back here. His wife was a famous architect who had worked closely with Frank Lloyd Wright by the name of Marion Mahoney Griffin. And she probably teamed up on many of Frank Lloyd Wright's commissions that would be found here in the north suburbs of Chicago. So the work of Simonds and Jensen was broadly inspired by the native prairie and oak openings found in the region around the Chicago area, in Michigan, in Iowa, Wisconsin, all around the Great Lakes states. They took these landscapes, the scale of the outdoor spaces, the vegetation, and used these features artfully in their designs. Here's a quote from Jens Jensen, one of his early impressions of the prairie. What's interesting here is that he likened it to being a forest cathedral. Many people had looked upon the Midwest prior to this as being somehow deficient because it didn't have as many towering forests as other parts of the country. And Jensen and Simonds as well saw great beauty in the prairie flora and the openness of the landscape and sought to use that as characteristic features in their work. Simonds actually preceded Jensen in his career as a landscape architect. He was born in Michigan in Grand Rapids area in 1855. And it was on his family's farm that he began studying the plants found along the fence rows and woods. He then studied civil environmental engineering at the University of Michigan, where he graduated 1878. And his first job after graduation was surveying the lands in Western Michigan that had actually been cut over to rebuild the city of Chicago after the Great Fire of 1873, I think it was, 1871. He fell in love with the West Michigan landscape, which he actually knew growing up as a child. He eventually bought land there, which is still owned by part of the family today. He then went to work for William LeBaron Jenney, who was a well-known architect in the Chicago area at that time. Jenney is known as the father of the skyscraper for some of his projects. He also was the first designer of the West Parks in Chicago that later Jens Jensen would redesign. Jenny went to work for, or Simonds went to work for Jenny's office. His first project involved surveying Graceland Cemetery. Skip over some details, but eventually he became superintendent of Graceland and became determined to make it a showplace of native plants. He argued that he was going to take native plants and give them a place of honor in this landscape, creating a place where people could recreate and feel comfortable in this landscape. Simon's design work was throughout the Midwest, but certainly a lot of here in the Chicago region. Unfortunately, many of the records of Simon's office work have been lost. He held an office at Graceland Cemetery, and when the office closed in the early 1930s, the records seem to have just been thrown away or otherwise disposed of. So one has to be a real detective to try to find out exactly Simon's work. These images are from some that he published, including on the top right, the home place for Julia Larned in Hubbard's Wood, Illinois. And then in the bottom slide here are four houses that were located along the edge of a golf course in Winnetka. I haven't traced exactly to where these houses were. It was really an early version of what we would now call a condominium complex, where the properties shared a common yard, and that allowed to take advantage of views from each house. You can see the photographs are from those houses showing these outdoor spaces that were held in common by all of the owners, as opposed to individual properties, something that was rather unique. In the slide of the Julia Larned property on the upper right, a couple of key features I want to point out. You see masses of trees and shrubs. Simonds was very interested in creating outdoor spaces that he called outdoor rooms, much like a living room or room inside the house. And he paid a lot of attention to views from the porch, from the windows of the house out to those spaces. And one of the lines, I'll just move for a second, located right here, is a view to the setting sun, where he planted masses of goldenrod along that would be highlighted at the during late summer as the sun was setting behind that long finger of space. And that became one of the features of the Prairie Style, this idea of capturing interconnected spaces and views across the landscape as a way of organizing those spaces. One could argue that Simon's work was also an early proponent of sustainability. This landscape designed for the Howell family in Dixon, Illinois, there was no real lawn other than mowed paths. The plantings were not entirely native plants, but they were certainly mostly native plants. And he was very concerned about protecting the shoreline along the Rock River here. But again, you see that the house was set back somewhat from the street. He didn't care about the view from the street and the sort of open lawns from that. In fact, at his own house in Chicago, which was on Montrose Avenue, he deliberately planted shrubs to screen the view of the house, caring more about what the views were from the rooms inside the house than what neighbors passing by would think as they walked across or drove across this landscape. Here in the bottom, you can see in many of the neighborhoods, this slide's kind of pixelated, but he often advocated for planting shrubs along the lawn, what was called the lawn extension, as a way of screening and providing privacy, so that as you walked along the sidewalk too, you would move through open spaces as well as fairly enclosed spaces as part of the overall landscape. One of the things I'll just point out, on the top of his roof there, you can see a little platform. He was enamored with watching storms come across Lake Michigan, and to his wife's dismay, would often hang out there during lightning storms. Simonds was very much involved in many of the small towns around particularly northern Illinois, although he actually worked in all 48 states at the time. He died certainly before Alaska and Hawaii became states, but he worked in every single state, but much of his work was based here in the Midwest. And these are some images of his parks, interconnected system of parks that he created for Quincy, Illinois. Some of the features that were important is constantly moving from dense forested areas to open meadows, and certainly qualities of light. Also respecting some of the Indian mounds that were found as part of these parks along the Mississippi River. One of the more unique projects that he created, I don't know if there's any alumni in this room from Michigan State University, but early on in the planning at Michigan State, he took this plan of campus and he drew a red line around this core of campus. And he argued that this space should be kept open forever as a sacred space, arguing that students at MSU would more appreciate the old trees and the openness of this landscape rather than any buildings that might be built in this space going forward. And he was very forward thinking in many places of his planning, arguing for that long-term protection of the landscape. And I thought this has always struck me as something rather unique, that he made a bold statement like this about a college campus. Where I lived previously and taught at the University of Michigan, he was involved in designing the overall park system. For Ann Arbor, he designed about 8 to 10 parks along the Huron River, including Nichols Arboretum, where I served as director. So I became very familiar with his work. Here's his plan for Nichols Arboretum, which was designed in 1906 and implemented in the years following. He also founded the program of landscape architecture at the University of Michigan, and most of the early faculty members came from his office here in Chicago. So, and he himself lectured routinely in Ann Arbor, taking the train back and forth between Chicago and Ann Arbor to maintain ties to the program there. This is just abbreviated list of some of his projects around the country. After his work at Graceland Cemetery, he was known as a cemetery designer. So he designed numerous cemeteries across the country, many of which we don't know about. Park systems for many small towns, Quincy, Madison, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Michigan, many college campuses like at Beloit College, parts of University of Michigan, parts of University of Chicago, parts of Michigan State campus, parts of Iowa State campus, parks in Lake Forest, parks in Highland Park, Port Sheridan. So certainly many places here in the north suburbs as well as throughout the Midwest. And moving to talk a bit about Jens Jensen. Jensen immigrated to the United States from Denmark in 1884. And he both maintained his strong identity and Danish roots, but he very quickly embraced the United States as well and America as his adopted country. He after coming through Ellis Island, he had short stints in jobs in Florida and Iowa before he settled in Chicago as a street sweeper for the Chicago West Parks. He moved up the ranks rather quickly. By 1888, he created his first known design for the West Parks, which was the American Garden in Union Park. Throughout his career, I think there was this blending of influences from his youth in Denmark, as well as his experiences in the Midwest. I was able to visit Denmark a few years ago to visit where he grew up. The Germans invaded this part of Denmark when he was 4 years old, and the battleground for that is considered to be fairly important in Danish history, so it's been preserved as a national military park. So it was thrilling for me to be able to walk the fence rows and the fields, much like they would have appeared in the time that Jensen grew up there. Along those fence rows were plants that he found complements in the United States. So where there were these wild roses growing in Europe, he found the prairie rose and the meadow roses native here to the United States. There are native hawthorns found along these fence rows, and he embraced the hawthorns that we have here in the Midwestern states. And probably most importantly in Denmark is this impression of the sky as part of the landscape. And this is something that he embraced as part of this open prairie landscape of Illinois, that the changing light and the changing storm systems. And I was struck that while I was in Denmark, we would have storms come across almost every day for part of the day, but often at the end of the storm, there would be a rainbow in the sky. And so that kind of changing sky is something that he thought connected people to the land around them. We don't know much about his design for the American Garden in Union Park, except that I'll mention it was found in this corner of the park over here. We know that he brought plants from nearby farm fields and fence rows into that garden. He claimed he was bringing plants that people who'd recently moved to Chicago from the countryside would have been familiar with, and providing a place where they could feel at home in the heart of the city. Prior to Jensen's work in the West Parks, much of the work that William LeBaron Jenney had done was sort of fighting against the flat landscape of the park. So in Humboldt Park, for instance, on the upper right-hand side here, an artificial waterfall was created. And then in the bottom, an image in Union Park prior to Jensen's work, it was full of all kinds of statuary, stonework, exotic plants, even a small zoo was there. And so what Jensen was trying to do was create something that really was more evocative of the native landscape in his design for the park. In addition to his Danish influences that he brought with him, Jensen early on struck a friendship with Henry Coles, who was one of the early professors talking about ecology at the University of Chicago. Henry Coles had determined many of his ideas about landscape change and ecological principles from studying the dunes along Lake Michigan. And Jensen and his wife would frequently go on explorations on Saturdays. They would take the trains out from Chicago to the surrounds around Chicago. Apparently they would bring back baskets of flowers. Sometimes the train conductors weren't that anxious to let them back on the train. But this became his way of learning the plants found around the Chicago area. And then I should mention that by 1899, he was appointed to the Special Park Commission that was looking at a whole regional park system around the city of Chicago and the metropolitan area, and would play a major role in forging what became known as the various forest preserves, both Cook County initially, but certainly Lake County, and the other counties around the Chicago region. He was fired from the parks in 1900 for refusing to participate in some of the graft that was rampant in the parks at that time. But then by 1905, a new administration came in, and there was a bond issue that allowed the remaking of the West Parks. And Jensen was rehired then as superintendent for the West Park system of Chicago. Humboldt Park is a good example of that remaking of the parks. As an immigrant himself, he was particularly concerned about creating a network of open spaces that would provide for these, particularly the factory workers that were found in the west side of Chicago. And he also was pulling from his friendships with many of the so-called prairie architects in the Chicago area in the design of new pavilions and park structures found in the park. So in the case of Humboldt Park, Hugh Garden was the designer of the boathouse and the other park pavilions found in West Park. One of the key features he adopted in West Park was what he called the Prairie River. And this was a place, these slow-moving, he was trying to emulate the slow-moving streams found in many Illinois wetlands. And the shorelines of these prairie rivers were planted to the native prairie plants found in the area. And on the left, you see sort of an image of that blue stream that emptied into a larger lagoon. And on the right, you see some images of the vegetation along those stream banks. Jensen was also very much connected to the Chicago Art Institute, and he convinced many of his sculptor friends to help put on sculpture displays in Humboldt Park, where they would show how their sculpture would fit against a more naturalistic setting. And you can see one of those in the central picture there. Both through his work in the West Parks as well as in the Special Park District, they became very enamored with the idea of providing small-scale green spaces throughout the city so that there would be neighborhood parks and playgrounds for children within almost all parts of the city of Chicago, and hopefully to inspire many of the suburbs that were growing at the same time. On the bottom right or bottom left is his plan for Cragen Park. I mean, I should step back a second. So initially, these playgrounds were more dominated by playground equipment, such as you see in these images, and the playfield shown on the bottom right. But on the bottom left is his plan for Cragen Park, which shows a much more naturalistic type setting of instead of active play structures per se, there were more outdoor spaces for children to play, with the idea that they use more of their own imagination to create their own kinds of play habitats. And that became expressive in the park on the right, which is his design for what he called the Lloyd School Center. This was a design for a prototype of a school. He felt that many of our schools were not particularly nurturing in terms of their treatment of the landscape. And so this was his proposal for an ideal school that had both a series of gardens to grow vegetable plants, places that it would serve as a bit of a neighborhood center where all generations would work together. So he saw older folks in the neighborhood interacting with school children to teach them gardening skills. And then there's both a boys and a girls separate playgrounds, but again, they had no play equipment. They simply had a lot of small rooms like spaces off the edges of trees and shrubs. And then one of the features that he called for here was what he called a player's green, up here, an outdoor theater space for holding outdoor productions and performances. Columbus Park on the west side of the West Chicago Parks, was a case where Jensen didn't have a park that had previously been designed by someone else. And so this gave him a much freer hand to create what he saw as an ideal prairie style park. And much like at Humboldt Park, there was a large water body. It was fed by water seeping out of these small waterfalls that he created and flowed into a larger lagoon that was surrounded by prairie vegetation. And he was particularly interested in attracting much of the wildlife, particularly birds, back to this landscape on the industrial west side of Chicago. At the center of the park, one of the primary features was to be a large golf course, but he felt that the golf course could at least symbolically represent the open spaces of the prairie landscape. And there was a lot of attention to being able to view this landscape at different times of day to see sunrise and sunsets. Much like at that Lloyd School Center, he included an outdoor theater space that again he called a player's green. The audience would sit on the lawn facing west, where they'd watch the sunset beyond the trees. Then on a clear night, the moon would rise to behind their backs. And if it was a bright full moon, it would illumine the play without artificial lighting. If it was a dark night, they would set bonfires on either side of the performance. But part of Jensen's idea here was that he felt that we as a culture in America didn't have the kind of intimate connection to the landscape in the way that he had growing up in the folk schools in Danish that held a lot of their celebrations and school events out of doors. And so he felt that holding these pageants outdoors were one way of connecting people to the broader landscape. And I think that's one reason he was so fond of Ravinia and the outdoor music festivals here in the north suburbs as well. The play that you see there on the upper left is a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream at Columbus Park. In the while that Jensen was working on the Chicago parks, he also began experimenting with private design work and working for many clients, particularly many wealthy clients, gave him the ability to experiment with many of the ideas he was formulating in terms of creating landscapes. Many of his landscapes, particularly the larger ones, were almost like small working farms and would incorporate food production as well as protecting woodlands, existing woodlands and other nature preserves and restoring them. And in all, much like Simonds in connecting these outdoor spaces with views, Jensen was very interested in creating places that would reconnect people to nature. Many of his clients were business people that had a lot of stress in the busier parts of their lives. And so when they would come home, it'd be a peaceful place to relate to. He did increasingly emphasize native plants. And initially, when he first came to Chicago, some of his earliest writings were experimenting with growing azaleas or other plants in the Chicago climate. And gradually, he became convinced that those plants weren't really suited to this landscape and began to emphasize the wilder plants that he had discovered around the Chicago area. And this became more and more fervent to him as a mission throughout his career to really celebrate those wild plants found around Chicago. Harry Rubin's estate, one of his earliest of these estates, and one that was found here in Glencoe, was one that he particularly celebrated. This is one that he advertised in many of the shows that the Chicago Society of Architects would organize in downtown Chicago. And you can see a picture of the house on the right. The lawn here was meant to be a representative prairie or meadow. Lawns, as we think of them today in terms of being purely one grass species, didn't exist at that point. So these lawns would have clover, they might have wild strawberry, they might have violets mixed in with it. they were pretty diverse places. And these were symbolic, he thought, of the broader prairie. And at the Harry Rubens estate was one of the earliest prairie wetlands that he created, and also one of his earliest experiments with what later he called the council rings, a circular stone seat around a fire pit. And this was it's a very important landscape in his overall career. These are just some images from different landscapes. On the upper left is the Becker Estate in Highland Park. On the right here is an estate for the Loeb family near Hyde Park in Chicago. On the bottom left is the Harley Clark Estate, which is in Evanston, and still some controversy over who's going to manage that landscape and the building going forward. On the bottom right is the Abby Roberts Longyear Estate in Marquette, Michigan, which was a collaboration with Frank Lloyd Wright. And on many of their projects, they had kind of a love-hate relationship. Mrs. Roberts Jensen liked to refer to this as trees with a cottage. Wright, of course, liked to call it a cottage with trees. Mrs. Roberts Longyear liked Jensen's idea of it being trees with a cottage, and so that, I think, irritated Wright to no end that she agreed with Jensen instead of him. One of Jensen's largest projects, and a very important project to him in his career, was the design of Fair Lane, the estate for Henry and Clara Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, which he began about 1913. Initially, Jensen refused to work for Henry Ford, claiming that he didn't think they would get along. But eventually he acquiesced and they worked together really throughout much of Jensen's career, doing contracts for Ford Motor Company. At Fairlane, Jensen created a artistic dam along the Rouge River. That was a hydroelectric dam for Henry Ford's power plant. On the right is what Jensen called the path to the setting sun. So this meadow space was aligned with the sun being set on the summer solstice. And this was an important feature for Jensen in terms of, again, connecting people to the various cycles of nature. Fairlane was part of a larger property of 26,000 acres that the Ford family owned in Southeast Michigan. The estate itself totaled about 2,800 acres, and Jensen developed the plans over between 1913 and 1921. Here again is a picture of the house, and just beyond that is the great meadow with some white birch trees planted along the edge of a pond there. And in a letter to Henry Ford, Jensen called sunsets one of nature's great spectacles. And Henry agreed that is one of the things that people could enjoy for free, but yet few people in our society take advantage of trying to observe either sunrise or sunsets. The stonework in Jensen's work here at Fairlane was some of the most extensive work of any in his career, this dam and a series of rock work along the river. And I like to think of this as really a living sculpture. It really is quite remarkable and how naturalistic it looks today, and how it's held up to many storms, many floods along the Rouge River, and yet the stonework has stayed largely intact. Some parts of it have been damaged, but you can see on the upper left-hand corner an image of it under construction. Then secondly, Jensen continued work for Edsel and Eleanor Ford, Henry and Clara's son, Edsel. He designed 4 different landscapes for Edsel and Eleanor, one in Grosse Pointe Shores, Michigan, which the images on the left I'll refer to. And then 2 on the right is called Haven Hill, which was a retreat for the Ford family in Highland, Michigan. He designed a a house in the city of Detroit that was taken over as the headquarters for the United Auto Workers. And then the property in Maine, which is now owned by well, I'm having a senior moment, but the Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart owns, and she's actually, I think, done a reasonably good job of preserving the Jensen landscape there. Over the last several years, I've had a chance to work at the Edson Leonard Ford House in terms of restoring a part of that landscape, the swimming pool and an adjacent lagoon with it. And as part of that, have a series of construction photographs. On the upper left, you can see the property they had to dredge. They dredged large amounts of the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair to create an island or a small lagoon for Etzel's motorboats. On the upper right, you see the logistics of moving large elm trees, where they would slice a large frozen circle of ground around the root ball of the trees and move them into a place. And then on the bottom left and bottom right are some of the stonework around the swimming pool and lagoon. And here's some historic pictures of that lagoon. And as part of the restoration effort, we worked very hard to capture the same qualities of this landscape. In some cases, trying to interpret the plants from the plant or the photographs themselves, because the plans were rather simplistic in terms of plants. And then here's this look just a couple of years ago at the dedication. Many of the stones had to be set back in place. And I haven't been back recently to see how it's fared, but it's pretty exciting to see it in its restored condition. And lastly, one of Jensen's major projects in his career was towards the end of his career, designing Lincoln Memorial Garden down in Springfield, Illinois, which was a project of the Garden Clubs of Illinois, the Springfield Garden Club, and the Garden Clubs of America, to create a living memorial to Abraham Lincoln using plants from the states where he had grown up. And on the bottom here, you see the plan that Jensen drew, some of the early plantings, and on the upper left, Jensen directing some of the planting there with Harriet Knudsen. One of the features of this landscape was very similar to his ideas for involving the public in outdoor performances, where school children collected acorns. They marched across the site in 1936, planting these acorns around the property. Also, members of the WPA planted young trees in the mid-1930s. And today it's still a very beautiful landscape with many different aspects of the landscape in the different seasons. I was told recently by somebody that this was one of the key places in central Illinois where you could hear both broods of cicadas overlapping at once. And so it apparently was very, very, very loud compared to what we experienced here in the Chicago region. Then Jensen's school, the Clearing, one of his last projects after he retired was he had a lifelong dream of creating a school for teaching of landscape gardening and conservation. And he did that up in Door County in Ellison Bay. I've had the privilege of teaching there for the last couple of decades, and we'll be up there again in October. I was there last year and right at the peak of fall color, which was absolutely glorious. So if any of you have any interest, you can explore theclearing.org. Give you a catalog of the various classes that are taught there. But it is a wonderful retreat place and a place to go explore Jensen's work in more detail. So briefly, I want to go over some themes in Jensen's and Simonds' work. Certainly, their landscape designs were based on observation of the native landscape and using its patterns as a basis for design. Both of them, I think, felt that too often people are much more influenced by what they see in other gardens and not from wild landscapes themselves. In Simonds' book, he talked a bit about how as humans, we tend to plant things in rows and very, very ordered type systems. and we almost have to force ourselves to plant things in more naturalistic patterns. And that was certainly very true in Simonds' work as well. There was interest in connecting gardens to an area's regional heritage and natural heritage. They both were very closely connected to the emerging science of ecology and how to apply that in their own designs. And then they didn't see their landscapes as being static. They saw them as places that would change and grow over time. So the idea of a Lincoln Memorial Garden planting acorns where you intend to be a forest eventually, they intended their gardens to last well beyond anyone's lifetime. And then they certainly used their designs to bridge broader conservation efforts. I'll go through these briefly, just a few images. They studied these outdoor room-like spaces, the trees, the meadows, the prairies that inspired their work. And they noticed that things were often deliberately sent off center. So this illustration on the right is from O.C. Simonds' book, Landscape Gardening, where he talked about creating a sense of mystery in his gardens, so that you didn't just know where you were going. Something was hidden in the distance that made you want to find it, as opposed to being too obvious as you move through the landscape. On the right here are some illustrations from O.C. Simonds' book, where he talked about how humans tend to plant in rows and in groups. And on the upper part of that diagram is how he thought if you observed a fence row, how you would see how nature plants, and thought you should maybe use that as a model. On the left top is the planting of trees along the edge of Columbus Park, where Jensen planted trees. Most foresters would tell you that you ought to plant trees 20, 25 feet apart. Look at those trees planted less than 5 feet apart to create a much more naturalistic edge to the park, or that naturalistic edge between the city of Oak Park and the Columbus Park. On the bottom center is Jensen's design for Etzel Ford in the city of Detroit, the swimming pool where he planted a series of red cedars, where it looked almost from day one as if it had just simply evolved there, as opposed to being deliberately planted. And apparently this pleased Etzel Ford to no end in terms of that place. This idea of outdoor rooms, the image there on the upper left is the Harley Clark estate, where Jensen created what he called a sun opening. He also thought the building was a little arrogant, so he apparently told Alfred Caldwell to cover it with trees. And then on the upper right is an image from Simonds' book where he urged people to look at the landscape during the winter, where the white snow would give you an impression of these more irregular shapes of what an outdoor space. And then on the bottom are two examples of Jensen's work. One is just a prototypical small garden where you would have a pathway through the massive trees and shrubs. You wouldn't really walk through the central lawn. You would look at the lawn space and the sunlight through the shady borders. And that was certainly very true. On the left here is the Mahoney Farms Park in Kenilworth, where the pathways follow around the edges of the meadow, looking through the trees and shrubs into the brighter sunlight of the meadow spaces. Native plants and wildlife, again, were a central theme. On the upper left is a diagram for a bird garden that Jensen created in the Loeb family's garden near Hyde Park. And the bottom left is many of Jensen's gardens included bird pools. Sometimes they were set in the ground, as this one for the CB Camp property in Oak Park. Other times at Mahoney Park, there's actually a raised bird pool. And then on the upper right is one of Jensen's photographs from the Indiana Dunes. He typically would take pictures of a larger habitat and then take close-up pictures of some of the individual plants. So it leads me to believe that he was always thinking of how a plant fit within its context, rather than just simply plants in a design. I already talked about the Lloyd School Center, but clearly there was always this emphasis on places for outdoor learning and celebrations. On the upper right is the Jensen studio landscape on Dean Avenue in Highland Park, where that's the Jensen family out doing a little dance number on the lawn. On the middle left is at the Henry Ford Estate in Fairlane, the players green that he created for the Ford, Henry and Clara Ford. You would sit behind those masses of grasses, or the play would take place, or the performers would perform behind that, and the audience would sit in the front where the chairs are located. And then on the left, I don't really know where this is, but this is in one of his private estates where he created a players green, and the clients would have outdoor performances as part of their entertaining. Both Simonds and Jensen were very attentive to qualities of light. Jensen was a member of the board at the Art Institute in Chicago, and he greatly admired the paintings of George Inness that often were pictures of a clearing in a forest, or pictures of a sky with very vibrant light coming down. And those were things that he captured by manipulating where there was shade and where there would be sunlight in the landscape. And the same was true of O.C. Simonds in terms of creating a series of experiences in the landscape where you would move from shadowy areas into sunlight and then back again, as opposed to seeing the landscape as just a static place. The center photograph on the bottom is the lodge at the clearing, which is set to face the setting sun over Ellison Bay. And then on the bottom right is one of his sun openings at Lincoln Memorial Garden. And then clearly this pattern of planning for change, and Lincoln Memorial Garden is probably the most best example of that in terms of planting acorns and waiting for those trees to grow. The bottom right is what those trees look like more or less a few years ago, after those kids planted them in 1936. And then lastly, their work was broadly connected to conservation efforts. Jensen himself created two conservation organizations, one called the Prairie Club, which was meant as a way of getting people out into the out of doors. They would take what they called Saturday afternoon walking trips, take people on trains out of Chicago. The original goal was to take people from the tenement houses out to the outskirts around Chicago. I'm not sure they attracted a lot of people to go on those trips, but they held them anyway. And then secondly, he created a group called the Friends of Our Native Landscape that was very influential in setting aside many of the Illinois state parks. They often would use massive celebrations as a way of arguing for the conservation of the landscape. The Indiana Dunes was a key place that they tried to protect. And the bottom right shows one of the dune pageants that was enacted there in 1918. So then quickly, I want to move to sustainable landscape design today. So oftentimes our incentives today are maybe a little bit different, but somewhat still the same. Oftentimes people are trying to create more sustainable gardens that reduce energy use, water consumption, fertilizers, certainly greater connection ecologically, and opportunities to really preserve local heritage and identity. The challenge in many cases is public perceptions, that people still have strong ties and connections to those lawns, those pure lawns that have no weeds in them. And that's a hard thing to overcome. Oftentimes there's not much of a knowledge about how native plants grow. There sometimes are weed ordinances that make it hard to grow wilder looking plants in your yard. And then there often are changed site conditions that have changed the soils on sites. And then sometimes there's just a lack of understanding about how to use native plants in garden contexts. So one of my colleagues at the University of Michigan, Joan Nassauer, has done a lot of research on looking at what makes some native gardens more acceptable than others. One of the things that she has found and consistently surveyed to people is that what she calls cues to care. So people want to know that a landscape is cared for and that it's not just abandoned by the owners. And so oftentimes that means paying attention to the edges, how it's perceived, how people move through the landscape. Anything that really gives it a human scale can help be providing a cue that it's cared for. sometimes advertising the habitat value. So on the bottom left, there's a couple of signs there that indicate that this garden is intentionally planted as a native garden, or talk about it being habitat for pollinators. Oftentimes connecting it to wildlife use is important. A friend of mine created the garden shown on the upper right-hand corner here at the University or the Henry Ford Community College in Dearborn. And she put a series of birdhouses through it, even though she never intended to attract birds. But having those birdhouses there made people willing to accept its wilder character, just because they associated it with bird habitat. And that kind of cue is often very important. And then sometimes just providing a greater abundance of flowers than what you would see in the wild can make it more acceptable. And then also providing change or allowing that it has seasonal interest through all times of the year. Here are some examples. As was mentioned earlier, I've been very much involved with the group called the Wild Ones in the Ann Arbor area. Here are some images of sort of older urban homes. One of the things we did as an organization was also tour each other's properties to take a look at people's gardens and what kinds of ideas you could get. And you see some of the things that the edging, sometimes using stone as edging, using pathways, creating little places to sit amongst the wildflowers. All of those are some of the kind of cues that make it feel more livable as opposed to just a wilder looking yard. Here's more of a suburban home on the outskirts of Ann Arbor, where the owner had, it wasn't a purist wild landscape, but she took large swaths of her backyard. Particularly, she and her husband during COVID in particular spent a lot of time working on their yard and refining it because they were stuck at home all the time. But they incorporated spaces for their grandchildren to come and play, and some boardwalks to a wilder area in the back of the yard, and even hammocks hanging on the trees. There are examples here in the Chicago area. Some of you are probably familiar with Prairie Crossings up in Grese Lake, which was a landscape started from scratch with large controls that people don't have freedom to plant whatever they want there, that they're restricted to having a broader landscape of prairie and forest restoration, and then smaller envelopes around their house where they can have more manipulated plants. One of the greatest resources, I think, today, and greatest advocates for a native landscape is Doug Tallamy, who wrote this book about a decade or more ago called Bringing Nature Home, urging people to think about the habitat value of the plants that they're planting in their landscape. And then his more recent book, Nature's Best Hope, which lays out an argument. I know there's some stickers over here, what he calls the homegrown national park, where you would register your landscape as part of a network of spaces to provide habitat for birds, for butterflies, and for insects. Back when I learned plants as a landscape architect, we were constantly urged to plant plants that had the fewest insect problems. What Tallamy has done is turn that on its head, where he wants you to plant the plants that provide habitat for the most insects, because those insects in turn are the food for birds and other wildlife that use our landscapes, and we're losing that habitat at such a rapid rate today. Here's a couple of examples at the University of Michigan campus. This on the upper part is a butterfly garden that was created outside our Museum of Natural History. Unfortunately, they had to tear down that garden, and as they built a new biological sciences building, and on the bottom is how they replanted many of those same plants with the new building in the background. It doesn't have quite the same scale or interest in my mind, but at least they kept these native plants as part of the overall campus. One of the places I've grown very fond of, and this was done under Mayor Daley, probably 15, 20 years ago now, but the Chicago Center for Green Technology down close to Humboldt Park. It's a former Kraft Foods plant that was set up as a place to demonstrate how plants can be used to clean urban soils, how plants can be used to filter stormwater. And this was meant as part of an overall agenda for demonstrating the city's commitment to green technology. The idea of filtering rainwater has certainly been very popular in many circles. Around Southeast Michigan, this was very much touted of people putting rain gardens in their yards as opposed to connecting them to stormwater systems. And in our case, our public libraries actually became one of the first advocates of this. And almost all of the libraries in the Ann Arbor Public Library system demonstrated to the public how they handled stormwater on their property, and was sort of a great learning example for people in the community. Also, there's been a great learning from places in Europe, particularly Germany, Switzerland, and some of the Scandinavian countries, of turning roofs into green roofs as a way of both capturing stormwater and it's a place for native plants. On the bottom right, I had a class take a field trip. We came to downtown Chicago and were able to go up at that time on the City Hall green roof. Shortly after this, they stopped allowing people to go up on the roof, but it was quite magical to see this little oasis of native prairie in the heart of downtown business district. And then the other pictures there, some other plantings of on roofs. In Ann Arbor, I had a green roof on my garage. And these are some pictures of it through the season, some prickly pear cactus in bloom, and some of the plants. This was view out our bedroom window was much more attractive than a typical flat black roof. And then here are some images of our yard there in Ann Arbor, just showing some of the seasonal changes. I haven't owned a lawnmower in probably 50 years, but we had lots of seasonal change. In the middle there, you see a bit of a vegetable garden sort of intermixed with the native plantings, and all three of these are views of our front yard in Ann Arbor. And lastly, one of the projects I was involved with as the director of the Matthaei Botanical Gardens at the university was a creation of a Great Lakes Gardens, we call them, plural, by Insight Design Studio. On the upper part, you see the site of that garden under construction. The intent was to mimic many of the habitats found around the Great Lakes, from sand dunes to cobble beaches to Alvar, which is a limestone-dominated shoreline. And on the bottom are some of the images of the different parts of that garden as it came into play. And this has been a great resource then, much like the Chicago Botanical Gardens or the Morton Arboretum here in the Chicago area, for educating people about the plants that grow in our region and how they can be used artfully in a design setting. And we have inspired artists to come in. A local group of ceramists decided to hold a festival of their work with sculptures scattered throughout the garden. And lastly, one of the themes that was both important to Jensen and Simonds, and certainly important to me in terms of advocating for native gardens, is the thinking about how we inspire the next generation to think about spaces. And one of the things we did at the Arboretum was create a space for children to create fairy gardens. And seeing children come out there and spend several hours creating their own miniature landscape was really quite rewarding. And they would come back and retool it again and again and again. And so helping foster that connection with the landscape is something that I think is really critical, both learning from these historical traditions as well as advocating for the future. And I'm going to end with this slide with two quotes, one from Jensen, one from Simonds. From Simonds, by teaching people to see the common things, you will add to their joy in living. And then from Jensen, landscaping, a composition of life that unfolds a mysterious mystery from time to time until mature age. So with that, I'll stop talking and invite you to ask any questions. Thank you. Yes.
You said Jensen worked on the Morton Arboretum. Was he working on it at the time that the Mortons were living in residence there?
Well, actually, I should say that O.C. Simonds designed the original part of the Morton Arboretum and worked very closely with Joy Morton on that. Jensen did do work for two of the Morton's daughters on some of their property that was adjacent to that, but not so much on the Morton Arboretum itself. But clearly O.C. Simonds worked very closely with Joy Morton, went out to his property in Nebraska, advised him on things there as well as at the Morton Arboretum. And so, yes.
I'm a landscape designer. I have been for 15 years in the North Shore area. And we face a battle, it seems, with municipalities all along the shore because the tradition of where public works operates enforces and sustains grass use, mowing, and many other aspects of the water comes, the way water is diverted and so. And it's very difficult to change that mental picture and to get a paradigm shift. It seems that in the towns, people are adopting native plants much more readily. But this tension between the way things are maintained in the towns versus what's done on the residential property is a tension. And I'm wondering how much you see that as the next big obstacle or thing that has to be challenged, moved forward, and what you're seeing around the country.
Yeah, it's very different in different communities. Many towns have tried different things. For one, earlier in Ann Arbor where I lived, the city tried to they would give you a permit for creating a native yard, but you had to apply for it and it had to be reviewed by some people in the city. The city officials decided they really didn't want to be reviewing that, and so they just basically granted open for people. And they found that it was a conflict because many of their goals as a city were trying to promote native flora, more sustainability. And so on the one hand, their park system and the naturalists on staff were promoting native landscapes, and their ordinances were fighting it. And so they found they really had to become much more open to agreeing to people having native yards. And they also began a grant program that would install rain gardens in people's yards, because many of the watersheds in the city were either they needed to spend great public expenditures to upgrade sewer systems or storm sewer systems. And they found that if they worked with individuals to reduce the stormwater demand, they could get by with not upgrading some parts of the system. So there were a lot of economic incentives that were forcing the city council to really be much more flexible. Now that Ann Arbor's a college town, has a lot of things like that. But I just came from a conference in outside of Cincinnati, where it seemed like there were lots and lots of people that are advocating for more native yards and gardens, and other parts of the country as well. I know that there are lawyers that are working with the wild ones, trying to challenge many of the ordinances that restrict native plants in people's yards. Some years ago, I did a study of landscape ordinances in Southeast Michigan and found that a lot of them were based on poor scientific information. There's advocacy that native plants would encourage rats. Native plants were particularly threatening to people. They had lists of native plants that they wanted to exclude from acceptable in their community, and there really wasn't any basis for that. It seemed really haphazard. And some plants weren't, it was really weird when you started to look at the list of plants that they were advocating for street tree planting, and no consistency. And they weren't providing good basis then for the inspectors to come out to a landscape and enforce the rules. And so in many communities, lawyers have begun challenging those things on a piecemeal basis to start, and a gradual opening. The other thing that I've noticed in the Chicago area, my wife and I recently moved to Wheaton, and what I'm seeing in that part of the Chicago area is that a lot of corporate entities and public parks and government buildings are demonstrating on their own landscapes more of a native garden approach. It's not necessarily filtering into the residential yards per se, but at least they're advocating in terms of the properties that the city and township and city and the villages control to be more natural. And there's some actual wonderful design work I see in like some of the forest preserve headquarters and things like that, that I think become very good models for what could happen in private yards as well. And there are examples up here too, for sure. We're touring around some today. But I don't have a great answer for at least how to advocate in the communities here, because I don't know the local politics, but I know that other communities, are making headway there, and I don't know what the magic formula is to make that happen. But sometimes it's taking baby steps and using this thoughtful design in a way that doesn't isn't confrontational.
I don't think it's so much the look per se, but you're dealing with maintenance issues.
Mhm.
So if your public works area is used to taking a mower and in 10 seconds, that's an exaggeration, but in a few minutes, mowing a public area, that's very different than them having to go back
Yeah,
and cut seed heads.
and that is
And that's where the
yeah. And that is one of the changes that is evolving in other parts of the country. Southeast Michigan, there are lots of companies that now are available for maintaining a wilder landscape, from private yards to public landscapes, and people are making a good living in doing that. And so that's something that I've seen a major change in some areas, and it takes what I've seen happen is more, few people starting that and it catching on in terms of, because that is a downside for a lot of people in not knowing how to maintain when they put all these plants in. And actually it was interesting that when my wife and I sold our house, one of the big fears in a lot of people is that would detract from your property's value. And we found just the opposite to be true, that we found a ready market of buyers who were willing to pay top dollar for a native landscape that was already in place, as opposed to having to create it themselves.
Well, Doctor, we have time for one or two more
Okay.
questions. And then we're gonna stop the event after that, but then you can still hang around till 8:30.
Sure, I'll be glad to answer questions.
When Simonds and Jensen were doing their work in the United States, was there anything comparable going on in Europe or Asia or the Indian subcontinent in terms of what landscape architects were thinking about?
Yeah, there was a comparable effort in Germany, which had some themes that were not particularly wonderful leading into the Nazi era. But there was, much like there was this in the Nazi philosophy, that this Nordic superiority, there was this whole movement to using native plants in Germany because they were more superior to all the cultivated plants that had been advocated. And so there actually were a number of leading landscape architects that had significant roles in the Nazi party at that time. And there's actually been some things written claiming that Jensen carried that same complex. He admired the work that was being done in Germany, but once he saw Hitler come into power, he was not supportive of what they were doing. He refused to go give a talk in Berlin and so forth. But Jensen's work was very popular in Germany because it fit with some of the themes that both designers and scientists were advocating there in the late 1800s as well. But otherwise, I think I'm not really aware. Certainly in England, William Robinson was advocating for wilder gardens in the late 1800s, and there always was within this English garden tradition, through the cottage garden, kind of a wilder aesthetic that permeated many of their gardens as well. Those are the two places that I see most comparable to what was going on in the United States. Any other question?
I could ask you one more question about, have you been asked to be an advisor to developing parks And if you were asked, is that an easy job or do you find, I go to park meetings, park district in Wilmette, and there's a fight every month meeting. So I just wanted how you view an offer like that.
Well, I don't know. I certainly don't like to get embroiled in politics, but I certainly had a lot of battles that I fought within the University of Michigan system. So I mean, it's not just communities; it also can be within universities in terms of that. And I don't, you just keep battling on or finding examples and trying to make arguments best you can. I don't have a magic solution for that. Oftentimes public meetings are not a very good place to do that. You can get some small groups and build constituencies. That's much better in my mind.
Okay,
Okay.
sorry to have to cut things off, but it is time to end the meeting. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to Dr. Matthaei.